Hello there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to Custer's 7th Cavalry. Today we're going to talk about the final year and a half of Captain Thomas Ward Custer's life. And Tom Custer spent most of his military career under the command of his older and much more famous brother, General George Armstrong Custer. Therefore, Tom sometimes gets overlooked because of his brother's deeds. But don't worry, Tom had a really interesting life of his own. Not least of it being that he was threatened by the Lakota warrior Rain in the Face, who said he would cut out Tom's heart and eat it. We're going to see if that happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and lots of other things, guys. So let's get started. Thanks so much for joining me.
You guys might remember that Tom had a fiancée, Lucia Gregory Burgess. Well, my friend, the Little Bighorn researcher Dale Cosman, recently found this image. It was printed in the novel The Other Custer by George Albert Mestemaker, and it's purported to be Lucia circa 1869-1870, which is probably around the time she and Tom met. The author said this image is at the New York State Historical Association Library in Cooperstown, New York, where Lucia was from. But unfortunately, that historical society went defunct in 2017, so I haven't been able to authenticate it. But if it is Lucia, it's incredibly exciting. I've never seen a picture of her before. Tom had written his niece Emma just before leaving on the Black Hills expedition in the summer of 1875. I expect, or at least hope, to be married soon after I get back, probably between the 15th of September and the 10th of October. He signed it, "Goodbye, dear Emma. Always love your uncle, Tom." But of course, there was no marriage. When Tom returned from that campaign in the fall of 1874, Lucia's days were numbered. She was suffering from tuberculosis, or consumption. Consumption was called the Great White Plague and White Death because of how white the skin of victims became, and it was a leading cause of death in the United States at the time. This is a lung disease, and the victims of severe cases would cough up blood, have fevers, night sweats, and severe weight loss, until finally dying of respiratory failure. Lucia had already been quite weak the last time Tom saw her. She died in February 1875 and was buried in Cooperstown, New York. It was after Lucia's death in the spring of 1875 that Rain in the Face, whom Tom, in a rather elaborate mission, had captured and arrested for murder, escaped from Fort Abraham Lincoln. Rain in the Face had admitted to killing two unarmed civilians, the veterinarian Dr. Honsinger and the sutler Ballaran, during the Yellowstone campaign. After his capture, Rain in the Face repeatedly swore he would get revenge on Tom, whom the Lakota Sioux called Little Hair. Rain in the Face said, "I told Little Hair that I would get away sometime. I wasn't ready then. When I did, I would cut his heart out and eat it." After his escape, Rain in the Face said he, quote, "sent Little Hair a picture on a piece of buffalo skin of a bloody heart. He knew I didn't forget my vow." And there's more on that story in my earlier video on Tom. After Lucia's death and Rain in the Face's escape, you'd think Tom Custer would be ready for some peace and quiet, but nope. In letters to his niece and confidant, Emma Reed, Tom was restless. There was snow at Fort Lincoln in early May, and he wrote how he took his friends on a sleigh ride. He also revealed that he felt lonely on Sundays, and he mentioned how he hoped to go east the following summer of 1876 for the centennial celebrations. But we all know that was not going to happen. There was no campaign for the 7th Cavalry during the summer of 1875. Tom had to find some ways to keep busy, and he did. As you can see in this photo, that's Tom driving the carriage, and next to him is one of the Wadsworth girls. Behind him is William Weiner Cook and another Wadsworth girl. And we're going to see a bunch of photos of those ladies from my friend, the living historian and writer Gary Stewart's book, Fates Change Horses. Okay, so I've got permission to show you some of the images from Gary Stewart's book. And I think it's fantastic to see them because just it gives a different sense of Tom Custer that you don't get from a kind of dry history book, and his sense of humor. So these ladies, we have Helen and Emily Wadsworth, and we're not quite sure if they are romantically linked with Tom Custer and William Weiner Cook, but the gentlemen certainly enjoyed taking photos with the ladies, and Tom even let one of them wear his 2 medals of honors in a bunch of these photos. So Dr. Lawrence Frost thought the Wadsworth girls were from Monroe, Michigan, but actually more recent research from Gary Stewart and Dale Cosman have proven they're from Chicago. Let's see, I think there's one more. Yeah, awesome. Here's a rather iconic photo of the Custers with friends and other 7th Cavalry officers on the steps of the Commander House or the Custer home at Fort Abraham, Lincoln. There's the Wadsworth girls right in the front, and of course there's Tom Custer sitting very close to one of them. And this is Boston Custer with those great sideburns, and Boston was, I think, 6 years younger than Tom. He was the younger brother. And there's James Calhoun, who is married to the baby of the family, Maggie Calhoun. That's Libby Custer, who is married, of course, to George Armstrong Custer. And that is Maggie Calhoun, the baby. And there's George Custer. And this is Gary's colorized photo of the same image. And then here's kind of a cool pared down version where James Calhoun is looking very chill back there with his white shirt showing. And then here's the inside of that very same house. And you can imagine they spent quite a few evenings in there, especially in the winter. So that's George Custer at the piano. And of course, there's Tom Custer behind him, leaning in very close to a young female. Tom, the ladies' man. Here are some more social photos of the Custers with fellow officers and friends. This one from a picnic at the Little Heart River in July of 1875. And this image, you can see I've cited below. It's from civilwartalk.com. And I think it's great because it's nice to see the names right there underneath the faces. 'Cause too often there's this huge paragraph of listing of names and the people are kind of jumbled up. But it's not 100%, but most of the names are right and you can get a sense of who is who. Herbert Swett wrote home on June 28, 1875, about a beautiful spot on the Little Heart River 8 miles from Fort Abraham, Lincoln, that was selected for a picnic, quote, for the benefit of the ladies who have never been out. And here's Gary's colorized image. Swett wrote that when Tom and Cook returned from scouting and picking the spot, they caused a scare when they were taken for hostiles. The alarm was sounded and 2 companies were mounted and went out, but everything calmed down once they realized the mistake. Swett once more wrote home detailing how they'd gotten to the campsite on the afternoon of Thursday, July 1st, arriving before sunset. Tom Custer and Cook, with 50 men, had left early in the morning to set up camp so it would be ready when all arrived. Then tents were arranged to form a square on 3 sides with their wagons forming the 4th. Let's zoom in on Tom, who is, of course, by the ladies, and there is Cook with the flowing sideburns down, also by the ladies. Swett mentioned that he would be leaving with those Wadsworth girls on July 8th, and according to the returns for Fort Abraham, Lincoln, Tom and W.W. Cook went on a leave of absence from July 8th to July 15th as well. So maybe they escorted the girls home to Chicago with Herbert Swett. So maybe there was something, a brew there. In late summer 1875, a clergyman, a Mr. Matchett, came from the east with the intention of converting the Plains Indians. Tom happened to be on the same train as this older gentleman, and the missionary got off the train at one of the stops and began preaching at the station. A crowd gathered, but when the old man began to sing a hymn, the only response was laughter and sneers. Tom and his friend noticed this from inside the train, so they got out. Tom went and stood on one side of the reverend and his friend on the other. They joined him in song. This changed the tune of the crowd, who also began to sing along. Then Tom brought the old missionary back to Fort Abraham, Lincoln, to meet with George and Libby Custer. In September 1875, Tom went on leave once again with Lieutenant William Weiner Cook. The men stopped at Chicago, maybe they visited the Wadsworth girls, and then they went on to Monroe, Michigan, and then they went to Ontario, Canada, which was Cook's home. Tom and Cook returned to the United States in November. They stopped in New York to see George Armstrong Custer and his wife Libby, who were on leave there themselves, and altogether they attended a play. Libby would write of it, "Colonel Tom and one of the oldest friends we had in the 7th were with us part of the time, and we had many enjoyable hours together. The theater was our unfailing delight. They were all desirous that I should see the military play Ours. When we reached the part in the play where the farewell comes, and the sword is buckled on the warrior by the trembling hands of his wife, I could not endure it. Too often that reality has been my own. The 3 men were crying like children, and only too willing to take me out into the fresh air." Tom was back at Fort Lincoln on November 25, 1875. In December of 1875, he was promoted to captain and became the commander of C Company. It was also in December that Libby wrote Tom, "I enjoy New York, but I miss you all. You, dear Tom, Maggie, and Jim. Don't spend more money that you can help at the Sutlers, drinking and card playing. Don't be influenced by the badness round you. Oh, Tom, if I find that the boy I have loved and prayed over has gone downhill. Oh, if only you had a companionable wife." Though the summer of 1875 had been relatively quiet, already George Custer knew the coming summer would not. General Grant's Secretary of the Interior officially gave an ultimatum that all of the Lakota outside of the boundaries of their agencies needed to return to the Great Sioux Reservation by the end of January 1876. Custer knew this was not going to happen, and he also knew the 7th Cavalry would be the ones called upon to enforce the new decree. George wrote his brother Tom a prophetic letter in early January 1876. "I have no idea of obtaining my promotion this spring or summer. On the contrary, I expect to be in the field in the summer with the 7th, and I think there will be lively work before us. I think the 7th Cavalry will have its greatest campaign ahead." On George and Libby's return west in February 1876, and as he had done when they were trapped in a frozen cabin in Kansas, Tom once more saved them, this time when their train could no longer travel because of ice and they were stranded several miles east of Bismarck. The passengers climbed up to a telegraph pole cut into the wire and managed to tap out a message for help, and they received a response. Somebody tapped out back, "Shall I come out for you? You say nothing about the old lady. Is she with you?" Which is how they knew it was Tom, since Old Lady was his nickname for Libby. They forbid him to come out in that weather, but before long, Libby heard a great whoop and yell, such as was peculiar to the Custers. Colonel Tom was outside. He made light of the danger and hurried us to get ready, fearing the coming blizzard. His arms were full of wraps and his pockets crowded with mufflers the ladies had sent out for me. Libby was deposited into a pile of straw in the back of a sleigh driven by an old driver and his tenacious mules, and they made it home through that Dakota blizzard, and they were able to later send out help to the others still stranded. But the rail line had hardly thawed when George Armstrong Custer was called back east to testify before Congress about corruption in the Grant administration and how it was affecting both military posts on the frontier as well as Indian agencies. Back at Fort Lincoln in April, Boston wrote to his niece, "Tom and I go over to Libby's every evening after dinner and play billiards, and we play partners. Tom and I jokingly pretend we want Mrs. Smith for a partner instead of Libby. So Tom will say, 'Well, you take her tonight, and I'll take her tomorrow.'" You guys will remember that there were a couple times when Tom needed to borrow clothes. Well, in April of 1876, George Custer was borrowing Tom's clothes. He sent Libby a letter from Washington telling her that the newspapers were reporting what he was wearing. Quote, "General Custer wore a black coat and light pants." Custer joked, "Tell Tom I intend to charge him for having his clothes advertised." George Custer made it back to Fort Abraham Lincoln just a few days before the summer expedition was to begin. Because of his testimony that implicated the Grant administration and indirectly Grant's own brother, President Grant removed Custer from commanding the eastern wing of the three-column offensive. Custer was ordered to be confined at Fort Abraham Lincoln and originally was not allowed to accompany the campaign at all. But the press was aware of Custer's removal, and headlines called it Grant's Revenge. Custer wrote a letter to the president. I appeal to you as a soldier to spare me the humiliation of seeing my regiment march to meet the enemy, and I do not share the dangers. Grant relented and allowed Custer to join the campaign. Department Commander Alfred Terry was ordered to command the expedition in person. Terry had no experience whatsoever fighting Indians. On his way back to Fort Lincoln, Custer stopped in Monroe, Michigan, and made the unfortunate decision to take along his 18-year-old nephew, Ottie Reed. He also took Ottie's sister and Tom's pen pal, 20-year-old Emma Reed. Back at Fort Lincoln, all of the 7th Cavalry was united on this campaign for the first time in their history, all 12 companies, 32 officers, and 718 enlisted men. Tom was the Company C commander, and 2nd Lieutenant Henry Harrington was his second in command, and Lieutenant James Calhoun was C Company's first lieutenant. But Calhoun was detached to Company L due to so many 7th Cavalry officers being detailed elsewhere. It was Tom who swore in the Arikara Scouts who would be joining the expedition. After medical exams were over, Girard took them to Custer's office where Custer's brother Tom, the one with the scar on his face, was. He raised his hand, and Girard told the Indians to raise theirs also. This was a family affair. George Custer, Tom, Boston, 18-year-old Ottie Reed, and of course brother-in-law Jimmy Calhoun, all were a part of this campaign. On the day they left, May 17, 1876, there was a formal parade through Fort Lincoln in an effort to show the families how strong the column was. As they rode by, someone made a comment about the Lakota enemy, and Tom called back with a wave of his hand to encompass the entire column of the 7th. He shouted, "A single company of that can lick the whole Sioux nation." The Custer boys still found time for pranks on the march, as they had during the Black Hills expedition. Boston seemed to most often be the butt of their jokes. One time when he stopped to take a rock from his horse's shoe, George and Tom rode off and hid, and then shot at Boston, making him think he was under attack by Indians. On June 17th, George wrote Libby, "We all slept in the open air around the fire, Tom and I under a fly, Boss and Ottie Reed on the opposing side. Tom pelted Boss with sticks and clods of earth after we had retired. I don't know what we would do without Boss to tease." It was on this same day, June 17th, that General George Crook's column, which was over 1,000 men strong, fought a 6-hour fight with the very Indians that Custer's column was tracking. Crook did not get word to Army Command, and certainly not to General Terry or General Custer, that the Indians were not only capable of staying rather than running, but also of fighting and of winning. Crook and his column, after this fight, turned back. Any plan to pin the Lakota and Cheyenne between the three commands was quickly falling apart. On June 21st, after Major Reno and 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry's right wing returned from their scout with information, there was a command meeting with Custer, Gibbon, and General Terry aboard the Far West. General Terry laid out a tenuous plan. He, with Colonel Gibbon's column, would come in from one direction with the 7th Infantry and the 2nd Cavalry in an effort to trap the Indians between the columns. Custer, though, was given Colonel Gibbon's best scouts, Mitch Boyer and George Herendeen, and also 6 Crow Indian scouts, signaling to everyone that it was Custer and the 7th who were meant to travel fast and directly toward the Indian encampment and strike first. The next day, the 7th, all 12 companies in the pack train, peeled off on their own and began the march that would end for many of them at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Tom was in command of Company C, though at times he acted as his brother's aide. For example, Tom did not accompany Company C on Reno's scout. Wrote 7th Cavalry soldier Charles Windolph, in the entire regiment, only one man had the complete and unquestioned confidence of Custer, his brother Tom. Tom's good friend Cook served as Custer's adjutant. Lieutenant Edgerly described the departure, writing, quote, "Everyone was in excellent spirits. We all felt that the worst that could happen would be the getting away of the Indians." On June 22nd, the same day that the 7th Cavalry started up the Rosebud, Tom wrote this to his niece Emma on a small, loose page of notebook paper in pencil, and was possibly the last letter he wrote. Mouth of the Rosebud, June 22nd. My dear Emma, I only have time to say a word before we cut loose. We are taking 15 days' rations with us, though we might be out longer than that. We can't tell, but I hope not. And if we make a success of this trip, I think we will start for Lincoln before long after our return. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But you mustn't count on that. Ought is getting along nicely. Your devoted uncle, Tom. Lieutenant Edgerly also wrote, quote, "We left the Yellowstone to go up the Rosebud. I went to regimental headquarters and sat down with Colonel Cook. Tom joined us, sitting on a log smoking, till Boss and Auntie Reed got him to go to the river for a bath. Soon the general came out of his tent, and I said, 'General, won't we step high if we do get those fellows?' He replied, 'Won't we?' adding, 'But it all depends on you young officers. We can't get Indians without hard riding, and plenty of it.' In the days that followed, the Indian trail grew larger and larger, and there was no doubt there was a tremendous amount of hostile Indians ahead. Custer's original plan was to surround the village and attack it at dawn on June 26th. As a fight became imminent, George Custer teased Tom in front of the scouts, pointing at him and telling his friend, the Arikara Bloody Knife, "Your brother there's frightened. His heart flutters with fear. His eyes roll with fright at the news of the Sioux. When we have beaten the Sioux, he will be a man." Maybe this was a typical Custer brother teasing. Maybe Custer wanted to add some levity to a tense moment. But maybe Tom had a premonition or didn't agree with Custer's coming plan of attack. The previous evening, Indian scouts with Lieutenant Varnum and Lonesome Charlie Reynolds went to the Crow's Nest. When Custer conferred with them the next morning on June 25th, 1876, they gave him conflicting advice. There had been reports that the 7th had been spotted by the enemy, and Indian scouts, both the Arikara and the Crow, believed they had been detected. Custer still wanted to wait and stick to his plan of attack the next morning on June 26th, but the Crow scouts whose land they were on were certain the Lakota and Cheyenne would flee and escape, and he urged Custer to attack the village immediately. Custer listened to the different arguments, and then he made the command decision to attack. Strictly following military hierarchy, Custer divided the 7th into 3 columns, with the pack train acting independently. Custer sent Captain Benteen and 3 companies. That's Weir's D Company, Benteen's own H Company, and Godfrey with K Company on a scout to the left to ensure the Indians would not escape that way. Then he gave Major Reno 3 companies as well. Companies A under Moylan, G under McIntosh, M under French, while Custer retained the headquarters and 5 companies of his own, C, E, F, I, and L. Company B under Captain McDougall was to protect the pack train. Benteen left first. A few miles later, Custer sent Reno and his companies into the valley to bring the Indians to battle, while Custer and his companies followed behind. After Reno set out, Custer learned the village was not fleeing as they supposed, so he took his men and rode through the bluffs with the intention of crossing the river further downstream and attacking the village in flank, a common cavalry tactic, much as Custer had done at the Battle of the Washita. Well, Custer's fast-moving plan did not hold. Reno did make it down into the valley, and he neared the village. The camp circle that he was about to attack was the Hunkpapa camp. And just to tie things together a little bit, Guess whose camp that was? Rain in the Face's. Rain in the Face said that he was part of the warrior wave that fought Reno. When Reno met with this fierce resistance, and he was afraid he was about to be surrounded, he retreated back to the last known place Custer had been seen, up on the bluffs. But meanwhile, Custer had moved beyond that point. He and his men had continued their attempt to get around and attack the Indian encampment. Captain Benteen, on his scout, not seeing any sign of hostiles in that direction, decided to return to the main trail. Boston Custer, whose horse had given out, got himself a fresh horse from the pack train, and he managed to ride past Benteen's entire column, chatting with officers and soldiers as he went, and all alone he caught up with his brothers. A messenger arrived at Benteen's column. Sergeant Daniel Knipe had come from Custer's column on the back trail. Knipe was a member of C Company, that's Tom's company. He would later say that Custer's column had not been far behind Reno when Reno first attacked in the valley. But then Knipe spotted 60 to 70 Indians in the distance, and he reported this to a sergeant, who reported it to Lieutenant Harrington, who told Captain Tom Custer. Tom then told General Custer the news, and Custer decided to go after those Indians. Knipe asserted that this was what was caused Custer's column to stop following Reno directly into the valley. Not long after this, Knipe said that Tom gave him these verbal orders: go back to McDougal and bring him and the pack train straight across the country. Tell McDougal to hurry the pack train to Custer, and if any of the packs get loose other than ammunition packs, cut them and let them go. Do not stop to tighten them. Tom also said, if you see Benteen, tell him to come on quick. A big Indian camp. Well, Knipe did this, meeting with Captain Benteen's column first. When he reported to Benteen, Benteen responded that he wasn't in charge of the pack train, and he sent Knipe further along back to McDougal. Next, Benteen received another messenger from Custer, this one being Custer's final written order, written in Adjutant W.W. Cook's hand: come on, be quick, big village, bring packs. Benteen continued to move forward until he reached the bluffs, where he found the repulsed and demoralized Reno and his men. Benteen showed Reno the order from Custer. Reno demanded that Benteen stay and help him and his wounded. Any movement to Custer from here on in was hampered and slow, and they never got much farther than Weir Point. The movements of George Custer's column from here on in are shrouded in mystery. Custer, with Tom by his side, was probably moving aggressively forward, assuming Benteen and Reno would soon join him. There may have been an attempt to cross into the village at the Medicine Tail River Crossing, or Ford B, but the soldiers were pushed back by the growing number of warriors. Custer's command held their own for quite a while, but once the disintegration began, probably with Lieutenant Calhoun or Captain Keogh's sectors, it spread outward. All the while, the men were waiting for reinforcements that didn't come, and as Weir Point, or Weir Peak, is within view of much of the battlefield, they probably spent a great deal of their final moments staring in that direction. The Lakota and Cheyenne surrounded them. Benteen and Reno had the pack train with the additional ammunition that Custer so sorely needed. The warriors just had to wait for Custer's ammunition to run out. Earlier in the fight, the Crow scout Curley said Mitch Boyer told him Tom Custer said the scouts had better save themselves if they could. Tom, as an aide-de-camp to the commander, his brother, would have been riding all over the battlefield, assessing the situation, delivering orders, etc. Custer's offensive maneuvers, or frontal and flank attacks, unsupported by the rest of the 7th Cavalry and with them running out of ammunition, of course, collapsed. The surviving members of his column were surrounded on all sides. They went on the defensive, consolidating desperately on Last Stand Hill. They killed their horses, who of course were their getaway vehicles. They had to create a breastwork to shelter behind. George Custer, with Tom, Boston, Autry Reed, as well as between 40 to 60 surviving soldiers, dug in for their last stand. Described M Company Private Edward Pigford, who watched from afar. At first, when we looked over toward Custer Ridge, the Indians were firing from a big circle, but it gradually closed until they seemed to converge on a large black mass on the side hill toward the river and all along the ridge. He also said the Indians, quote, looked as thick as grasshoppers. George Custer was shot twice, once in the left breast and once in the left temple. The first shot may have been the gunshot to his side, which entered his lung. The headshot would obviously have been fatal. Some believe that Thomas Ward Custer saved his last bullet for his brother, George Armstrong Custer, that in the final moments and with his commander and older brother wounded beside him, that Tom, in an act of mercy and knowing the brutality of the enemy, may have followed the adage of, quote, save the last bullet for yourself, but instead he saved his last bullet for his brother. But multiple eyewitness accounts who found and examined George Custer's body note that there were no powder burns, the implication being that it was not a suicide nor a close-up mercy killing. There were no survivors from this part of the fight. George Custer was found relatively unmutilated. He had been stripped naked and laid out on top of the bodies of two soldiers. But Tom Custer faced a very different end. He was found face down, his body so severely mutilated it was unrecognizable. There was a rumor that there was so much dirt under his fingernails that he must have been trying to claw himself away as the life was being beaten out of him. I'm going to rewind a little bit to Hunkpapa Sioux, Rain in the Face's confession about killing Dr. Honsinger during the Yellowstone campaign. Rain in the Face said, he had shot the old man, but he did not die. So he then went to him and with his stone mallet beat out the last breath left. So just for a comparison, guys, roughly doing the math on casualties during the Civil War, for every soldier killed on the battlefield, 2.5 soldiers were wounded in combat. Wounded. So there's no way to know if the percentage was similar at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But of the more than 210 men with Custer who died, chances are a lot of them were wounded and still alive when the pitched battle was finished. Lakota and Cheyenne eyewitnesses talk of soldiers trying to speak to them or pretending to be dead and trying to escape. And there's also at least one account of a soldier being taken alive, tied up, and later killed with knives. So when witnesses on Weir Point, where the remainder of the 7th Cavalry, more than 300 men under Major Reno and Captain Benteen, stood and watched the end of the Custer fight, claimed they saw Indians shooting at the ground near Last Stand Hill, dispatching of the wounded, chances are they were right. On June 26, Lieutenant Charles DeRudio, with a few men who had been left behind in the timber during Major Reno's retreat from the valley the day before, heard horsemen. When DeRudio, who was hiding, looked through the undergrowth, he thought he saw Tom Custer dressed as Tom had been dressed in buckskin and riding Tom's sorrel horse. DeRudio shouted, "Tom, send your horse over here!" But as the men on horseback turned around, DeRudio realized they were Indians wearing and riding the spoils of war. DeRudio and his party dove for cover and avoided being hit by volleys. Lieutenant Francis Gibson described the burial duty that occurred a few days later. On the 28th, the command moved to Custer's battleground and buried all the dead. I have been placed in command of C Troop, and my men buried Custer and Tom and their young schoolboy brother. I had them placed beside each other and their graves marked. Dr. Porter, the only surviving surgeon with the 7th, wrote, "Tom Custer was horribly mutilated. He was disemboweled, and his head had been crushed in by a blow from a stone hammer used by the Indians. The only arrow wound I found was in his head. He had the Sioux mark of death, which was a cut from the hip to the knee, reaching to the bone. His heart was not cut out." Lieutenant Godfrey wrote, "When I went to Tom Custer's body, it had not been disturbed from its original position. It was laid face forward, all the scalp removed, leaving only tufts of his fair hair on the nape of his neck. The skull was smashed in, and a number of arrows had been shot in the back of his head and body. We rolled the body over. The features where they touched the ground were pressed out of shape and were somewhat decomposed. In turning the body, one arm, which had been shot and broken, remained under. This was pulled out, and on it we saw tattoos, TWC and the Goddess of Liberty and flag. This, of course, completed our identification. His belly had been cut open, and his entrails protruded." Wrote one soldier, "Tom Custer's body was worst mutilated of all." First Sergeant Ryan wrote of the burial on Last Stand Hill, "At the foot of the knoll, we dug a grave about 18 inches deep and laid the body of the general in it. We then took the body of Tom and laid him beside the general. Then we wrapped the bodies in canvas and blankets and laid them side by side in the shallow grave, and then covered them with earth. This was the best burial of any of the bodies on the field." So, did Rain in the Face indeed exact his revenge? Spotted Bear, also a Hunkpapa Sioux warrior, said, "There was talk around camp that Rain in the Face killed Long Hair's brother." Well, plenty of other people thought so too. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a popular poem called The Revenge of Rain in the Face, in which Rain in the Face doesn't kill Tom Custer, but General Custer himself. In July 1890, 14 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the photographer D.F. Barry wrote a letter to Libby Custer, quote, "Before leaving Bismarck, I went to Standing Rock to see my Indian friends. My friend, Rain in the Face, asked to see the big chief's photo. I did not know who he meant, so he said, 'Long Hair.' I got it for him. He looked at it fully 5 minutes, handed it back to me. I got Captain Tom's photo and handed it to him. He turned it face down, shook his head, and returned it to me, and looked down at the floor for several minutes before speaking. I would have given a great deal for his thoughts just then. He tells me, and so do other Indians, that they don't know who killed Tom. But the Indians, some of them, do say Rain in the Face mutilated him." I don't know what D.F. Barry wanted Libby to do with that information, but it certainly did not comfort her or put her in a forgiving mood. She wrote a year later in an 1891 anthology of Civil War heroes about Tom's end, quote, "The vengeance of that incarnate fiend was concentrated upon the man who had effected his capture. It was found on the battlefield that Rain in the Face had cut out the brave heart of that gallant, loyal, and lovable man, our brother Tom." The conflicting testimony didn't stop. In 1894, Rain in the Face gave an interview with W. Kent Thomas, and he detailed how he had escaped Tom's custody in 1875 at Fort Lincoln. Rain in the Face said he, quote, "sent Little Hair a picture on a piece of buffalo skin of a human heart. He knew I didn't forget my vow. The next time I saw Little Hair, I got his heart. I have said all." But 2 months before Rain in the Face died in 1905, he gave an interview to the Lakota Dr. Charles Eastman. Rain in the Face described the men on Last Stand Hill. "A larger body remained together at the upper end of a little ravine and fought bravely until they were cut to pieces. I had always thought that white men were cowards, but I had a great respect for them after this day." He also spoke about Tom Custer. "Many lies have been told of me. Some say I killed the chief, and others that I cut out the heart of his brother because he caused me to be imprisoned. Why, in that fight, the excitement was so great that we scarcely recognized our nearest friends. Everything was done like lightning. After the battle, we young men were chasing horses all over the prairie, while the old men and women plundered the bodies, and if any mutilating was done, it was done by the old men. Personally, most accounts say the Lakota and Cheyenne did not realize they were fighting Custer or the 7th Cavalry until much later. But between the Sioux, quote, mark of death mutilation with that cut hip to knee and with Tom's head being smashed in with a weapon that Rain in the Face had admitted to using to killing another white man with in the past, I don't know. There were rumors from both Lakota and white sources that Rain in the Face's own conflicting evidence and his sort of guilty behavior afterwards makes me think it's not a stretch that he could have been involved, at least in the mutilation of Tom's body. On August 13, 1876, the townspeople of Monroe, Michigan, the home of Livy Custer and the Custer family, filled their Methodist church. The service remembered the 3 Custer brothers, George, Tom, Boston, as well as the young nephew, Harry Armstrong Reed, also Maggie's husband, James Calhoun, and Annie's husband, George Yates. When she learned of the tragedy, the matriarch, Maria Custer, had said, "How can I bear it, all my boys gone?" And those boys had entirely supported their parents. Even Boston Custer had tried to send up to half his paycheck home to his parents. Tom did not forget his parents in death. His mother, Maria, received his estate, a total of $902. Maria and Emmanuel were also able to apply for and receive a pension. A year later, in July 1877, a reburial party was sent out to reclaim the officers and bring them east, and to rebury the soldiers on the battlefield. This was led by Captain Mike Sheridan, General Phil Sheridan's brother. Captain Sheridan was actually the L Company commander, but he had been on detached service during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, so he missed the fight. Though they claimed to have properly ID'd the remains, there are conflicting accounts about whether that was even possible. The party originally exhumed who they thought was George Custer, only to find there was an enlisted man's shirt under those bones. So they tried another, and those were the bones they sent to Libby. Wrote a sergeant of this burial detail, "I think we got the right body the second time." But Scout George Herendeen later revealed, "Out of the grave where George Custer was buried, not more than a handful of bones were picked up. The body had been dragged out and torn to pieces by coyotes, and bones scattered about." We don't quite know what happened or passed as Tom's body, but on August 3, 1877, Tom Custer, alongside James Calhoun, George Yates, Donald McIntosh, and Algernon Smith, was buried at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Thomas Ward Custer was the first soldier in American history to twice be awarded the Medal of Honor. There is a Medal of Honor tribute to Tom at his home of record in Monroe, Michigan, at the Soldier and Sailors Park at the River Raisin waterfront. Tom joined the United States Army at the age of 16, and he fought for his nation for 15 difficult and conflict-filled years until he died at the Battle of the Little Bighorn at the age of 31. Though he is often overshadowed by his more famous brother, Tom sure packed a lot of living into the short amount of time he had on this earth. 7th Cavalry soldier Charles Windolph said Tom Custer had a loyal heart, and he described the young captain in a way in which we should all remember Tom today. He had served with distinction during the war, and had frequently before been engaged in Indian fights. There was in the Army no more popular a man than Tom Custer. He was young, handsome, and a prince of good fellows, and full of that bravery that ever characterized the Custers. These are the markers at Last Stand Hill today on the Little Bighorn battlefield. George Custer is the marker in the center there that sort of has the dark writing on it. And this is the marker for Thomas Ward Custer, who in memory, will always be at the side of his brother.
Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Please check the description box for my sources and leave me a comment, click like, click the notification bell. If you haven't subscribed already, subscribe. Please subscribe. Watch another video of mine right now. There's so many of them, so take a look. You might find something you like. And thank you. Thanks to everybody, especially my Little Bighorn friends. You guys are a constant inspiration. Okay, another video coming soon. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.